There is a sound in Spanish that I've noticed a lot of first language English speakers struggle to reproduce. For a handful of reasons, I believe. Firstly, and the most obvious one, is that this sound doesn't exist in the phonetic inventory of English. The second one is that this sound in Spanish is actually closely related to a whole variety of other sounds in the same language. And then finally, the Spanish version of the sound is just close enough to the English equivalent that it can throw some of us off. And I actually think this mistake is pretty widespread, but underreported. I've noticed it a lot from students who are learning Spanish and whose first language is English, and who might even speak Spanish at a relatively high level, perhaps an intermediate or upper intermediate level. But they make this mistake regularly, and it's difficult exactly to pinpoint it unless you have some degree of prior knowledge about what's going wrong here. I'll cut the suspense here by saying that what I'm talking about here is the pronunciation of the letter R and how that contrasts between Spanish and English. If you are learning Spanish and your first language is English, or maybe you are a Spanish speaker who also is learning English, or perhaps you're just interested in how the phonetic systems of both of these languages contrast and compare, stick around, because you might gain an insight here that will immeasurably improve your language learning skills. Whenever you learn a new language, you're bound to bring some feature of your first language, your previous language, or languages across. And linguists call this language transfer. It's a very simple term, but it's something that actually affects a whole variety of categories in any other language, from semantics to grammar, and of particular interest to us today, pronunciation. What we want to look at in this episode is how English L1 speakers struggle pronouncing Spanish Rhotic sounds. And I'm not talking about the widely discussed difficulty that English speakers sometimes have in rolling their R's, because that alveolar trill in Spanish, which we've made a video about, doesn't really exist in English. No, I'm actually talking about what Spanish would call the alveolar tap and how that compares with the English Retroflex R. So the Spanish alveolar tap is represented by the single letter R in normal Spanish orthography and is represented in IPA as this. It's a voiced alveolar tap, so that is to say we vibrate our vocal cords when pronouncing it, and we tap the edge of our tongue against the alveolar ridge, that ridge that's just behind your teeth. And we'll get back into the finer details of this later because that will become important, but it's that tap sound that we hear in words like pero or muro. And the problem for English speakers here is that the English phonetic inventory lacks an alveolar tap. In fact, in English instead, we have what is called a retroflex R. In writing, it's represented by the same letter R that we see in Spanish. And it's represented in IPA like this. In fact, there's a little bit of a complex history here that might be worth quickly addressing. In what we might want to call internal phonetic transcriptions, we'll usually just use the simple letter R. This would be the phonetic transcription used for the word purity in English. You see there's a normal R there. But however, in international phonetic transcription, which is my preferred method for obvious reasons on this channel, we represent the retroflex R in English with this symbol. And like the Spanish, it's voiced, we vibrate the vocal cords, but we curve the tongue towards the palate, almost as if we were restricting all the airspace in the mouth. It produces this R sound. In my accent, you would hear that in purity or remuneration. The only exception, again, in my accent of English, would be when this R is pronounced as a stop or not even pronounced at all, totally elided. That would be in instances like parlor, better, or butter. The standard American accent, for want of a better term, which is famous for being rhotic, where many British accents aren't, still has the same retroflex R, although it's almost always pronounced, if I'm not mistaken. For example, where I would say parlor, butter, or better, an American might say parlor, butter, or better. As a side note, this difference in rhoticity always makes me think of a brilliant joke in one of P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves and Wooster novels. It's called Aunts, Aunt, Gentlemen. And part of the joke, of course, is that assonance between aunts and aunt. Of course, if you're speaking with more standard American accent, the joke doesn't really work. I would assume, maybe you could correct me there, that most Americans would pronounce that as something like aunts aren't gentlemen. Anyway, back to the principal point of the video. What I've said just now about how the Retroflex R is the normal Rhotic sound in English, of course, needs a minor caveat. There is a lot of dialectical and accent variation across the English-speaking world, and so there are many accents that actually have an alveolar tap where there might be a Retroflex R. I'm not sure how many American accents would have this, but certainly there are many places in Great Britain that still have an alveolar tap. Interestingly enough, and I credit Jeff Lindsay, the authority on English phonetics on YouTube, for pointing out that actually the famous RP, received pronunciation accent, actually has an alveolar tap as Spanish does. For example, in RP, you might say something like purity, Paris. It's funny, having heard that accent so much naturally as an English speaker, I never noticed that actually that R sound was in fact an alveolar tap close to what Spanish has. Now, having looked in very broad terms at the landscape of rhoticism in English, what this means for English speakers is that for many of them, and I might go out on a limb here and say that for most English speakers, there's no equivalent in English to the Spanish alveolar tap. Now, you might say that this can be fairly easily fixed through some degree of exposure to languages that do have an alveolar tap. In fact, many languages have an alveolar tap. Most Romance languages have an alveolar tap. And with the rising global presence of languages like Spanish and Portuguese, it's increasingly likely that even an individual who exclusively speaks English has heard this alveolar tap many, many times. But despite this probably increased exposure, I find that many English speakers still struggle to reproduce the Spanish alveolar tap. In fact, interestingly enough, what I've noticed is that this r actually is often pronounced by some of the students who struggle with this almost as if it's a compromise between two other Spanish sounds. Strange as that might seem. That is to say, it's pronounced sometimes a little bit more like the word initial de in Spanish words like dedo, or the lateral alveolar proximant l, as in words like limpia in Spanish. And this makes sense because if you pronounce those all together, the Spanish alveolar tap r, the lateral alveolar l, and de, you'll actually see that they're very closely pronounced on that same alveolar ridge. Only millimeters of difference in articulation actually distinguish these sounds one from the other. I'm not here merely to diagnose a problem. I want to propose some potential solutions you, as a Spanish learner, might be able to apply. If you want to make sure that when you say pero and mira, you don't sound like you're saying pedo or mira, you certainly want to be especially careful about that first mistake. It might help for us to look very carefully at what differentiates these sounds in Spanish. Because, as I said before, the difference between r, d, and l in Spanish is extremely subtle. So let's first look at the central concern here, the voiced alveolar tap. As in pero or mira, it's produced with a single, very quick contact between the tip of your tongue and the alveolar ridge. The key here is both speed and also lightness. You don't hold your tongue in that position on the alveolar ridge, and that's why it's called a tap. And what I would recommend if you're an English speaker is be very careful about that. Make sure that you're pronouncing this firstly as a tap, but also be careful about how you position the tongue otherwise. You see, what I think a lot of English speakers are actually doing when they try pronounce this alveolar tap in Spanish is that they're reading into the sound the tongue position of the Retroflex R in English. Now, you'll remember that I said earlier that we curve our tongue upwards to pronounce this Retroflex R. Purity, remuneration. Say those words yourself for a moment and you'll notice what I think a lot of English students of Spanish are doing is that there's this ever so slight curve in their Spanish alveolar tap. And that's why you might find that you say words like pero as perro and mira as mira. Forget curving the tongue upwards. That doesn't exist in Spanish. Rather, it's important, hold the tongue in a comparatively horizontal, flat position, and you'll get the sound right. I'd like to recommend the following practice. When you're reading or listening to Spanish and you come across a word with the alveolar tap, pause for a moment and repeat that word a few times. Then isolate the R sounds. Let's say you're reading a travel brochure and you see the word feria in it. What you could do there is repeat feria a number of times. Feria, feria, feria. Isolate that sound, r, and make sure that you're pronouncing it according to the alveolar tap guidelines I've just provided. Become accustomed to doing this, and I'm sure you'll find that both your awareness of how to produce the sound and your actual comfort with producing it in practice will increase considerably. But what about those cases in which I've noticed students sometimes blurring the lines between their d, their l, and their r? Well, I think it might help for us to do a bit of substitution to make sure that the distinction between those sounds is really, really obvious. So let's start with d in Spanish. An important thing, of course, in Spanish is that word initial d and d that appears in the midst of a syllable are actually pronounced slightly differently. Think about the word dedo and look at how it's transcribed here phonetically, and you'll see what I mean. With this word initial d, the tongue presses more firmly and a little bit closer to the teeth on the alveolar ridge than the r. Think back to the alveolar tap we've just practiced and move the tongue a little bit closer to the teeth. Move from r in pero to d in dedo. Now let's work on some clearer differentiation. Take the word you just looked at, feria, and now replace that r alveolar tap with the d sound in Spanish. It goes from feria to fedia. Feria, fedia, fedia, feria, fedia. Practice that a few times to clearly cement the distinction between those two sounds in your mind. And you can then even do the same thing with the lateral alveolar proximant l. It's a more continuous sound produced by articulation further back on the alveolar ridge and with almost the air flowing around the sides of the tongue. L, l, l. Limpia, levantar, mala. Now what we can do is we can practice that same exercise as before. Let's try and substitute sounds in. Take our feria example from earlier, but now try it with the alveolar proximant, l. Felia, felia, felia. And maybe switch between the two. Feria, felia, feria, felia. Once you're comfortable with this, why not try it with all three sounds at once? Move from fedia to feria to felia. And once you do that over and over and over again, I think the distinction between all these three sounds will be very, very clear to you at some subconscious cognitive level. Before you know it, you'll be producing that clean alveolar tap that makes you sound much more authentically Spanish and that rewards all the effort that you've put into learning the Spanish language up to this point. But now, I'm actually curious. Let's go the other way around. Many of you out there speak Spanish or another Romance language. Do you find, given that the English Retroflex R is actually quite difficult for you? I'm really interested to hear because it's not something I notice a lot of Romance language speakers struggle with. Is it an easy sound, actually? I'd really love to hear your opinion on that. I'd love to get the perspective of someone who doesn't speak English as their first language. So let me know in the comments below. Did you find anything else interesting about that video? I'd love to hear from you. But until our next video, I'll say thank you very much for watching and adios, hasta luego.